This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political analyst Peg O'Connell, syndicated columnist and author John Hood, Chris Fitzsimon with NC Policy Watch, executive director of NC Policy Watch, I might add, and former legislator and former chairman of the State Board of Education, Phil Kirk. We've got what promises to be a good show for you this week, beginning with Governor Cooper's State of the State speech. We'll also ask the panel to examine how our state will be impacted by the repeal and replacement of health care legislation before Congress. And we'll talk about several proposals to borrow money. And of course, as always, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. Governor Roy Cooper delivered his first State of the State address to the legislature and to our citizens last Monday night. We want our panel to give you their assessment of the speech and how it was received. I want to go around the table and ask all of you, tell us what struck you about Governor Cooper's address. Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
Well, I thought it was about maybe even a little better than we expected. I think he hit the themes that we thought about: more money for education, more investments in early childhood. I think it was important that he reached out 13 times and said he was seeking common ground with the General Assembly. The only possible confrontational rhetoric in there, and I thought he was pretty soft pedaling, was about HB2 and he said I'm willing to accept a compromise.
And he teed off with that when he started.
He did, but I think it was smart to get it over with because everybody's waiting to see what he's going to say about it. But I actually thought the speech was well delivered. I think he laid out his agenda very well.
All right, Phil, what was your assessment?
Well, I thought that he had learned from probably the master, Governor Hunt, about picking 3 or 4 themes and sticking to them. I've heard him speak 3 times since he was inaugurated, and he has stuck to the themes that Chris and I'm sure others will mention. So I thought he did a good job with that. Are you going to ask us to give a grade, maybe?
Well, give me a grade.
I'll wait.
No, give it a grade.
Oh, I'd give him a B.
All right. Chris, what was your grade?
Oh, I'd give him a B+. I think,
all right.
Yeah.
Peg O'Connell, what's your assessment?
Well, I'm interested in health care, and I was very pleased to hear him talk about health as an important part of our state's future. He didn't specifically talk about Medicaid or anything like that, but he did nail that health is such an important part of who we are and how we can go forward. I thought the governor looked great. He seemed immensely happy to be giving this speech, and I would give him a B+ as well.
He looked at ease.
Yes,
Yep.
very much.
John Hood, your assessment.
I thought the speech was well constructed. I think particularly the phrasing, we're a state of promise, and all the different references to promise, I thought was clever and well constructed. I think that he did miss an opportunity. As you mentioned, in many instances, he talked about finding common ground. The problem is he didn't say anything positive that I could see about anything the Republicans have done in the last 6 years. Jim Hunt gave a similar speech after the '94 election when the Republicans took over the House, and it was a little different, and it was pitched in a way to try to actually bring Republicans into some conversation. I think that Roy Cooper definitely expressed his intention to do so, his desire to build common ground, but the speech itself didn't get him there.
So your grade?
I'll give him a C.
All right. So after the State of the State speech, Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger delivered the rebuttal to the State of the State. I want your assessment of that and your grade. Phil?
I thought it was a typical speech of the opposite party from whoever the governor is. He laid out what the Republican accomplishments of the last 6 years, many of which I would submit were not known by a lot of people. So I don't fault him for that. Some people did. I don't think he didn't mention, he didn't use the term common ground, I don't think, but he mentioned, I'd like for him to have talked a little more about specific ways that they could work together. And I'm a little bit optimistic that once they get over these court cases and some of the other divisive things, they're going to find some common ground.
So your grade for the rebuttal?
B-.
All right. John, what's your assessment of Phil Berger's rebuttal?
It was feisty. It was argumentative. I think he went into it assuming that he would know what Cooper was going to say and mostly getting it right. The interesting contrast is both speeches were really about the past a lot. Cooper talked a lot about his experience when he was in the legislature in the 90s, and Phil Berger talked a lot about the last 6 years. I'd give his speech a B. I think it was effectively communicating what he wanted to communicate.
Peg O'Connell, your assessment and grade.
Well, I think instead of a policy rebuttal speech, it was really more like a campaign ad for the Republican majority and Senator Berger in particular. I think for what I seemed to be that he was intending, I would give him a B+ as well. It was well delivered and really pointed.
All right,
I
Chris.
give him a D for dreadful. I was actually appalled by the rhetoric that Berger used. It's one thing to say what they accomplished. It's one thing to disagree, but he was talking about vulgar protests, and he was talking about treasonous things and attacking the media and the left. It struck me a little bit like a Donald Trump campaign speech. And interestingly, it appears from the coverage in the media that he gave the exact same speech or very close to it at the Rockingham County Republican Party convention the Saturday before, using the same language as quoted in the Greensboro paper. And that's what it was like. It was like a Republican red meat speech. And there's a time and place for that in politics, but I don't think the response to the State of the State address is that place. And I was actually disappointed. Disagree, talk about what you've accomplished, but don't go over the top with the rhetoric and the words. I thought it was dreadful.
He was dismissive of the governor. A little, almost disrespectful to some extent.
I would
By the way,
concur.
for whatever it's worth, I did a little poll and I asked 10 people what they thought of the speeches, and 1 out of 10 had seen them. So I don't know how many people. Seriously, I don't know how many.
That's right.
And that's probably a high
watched it.
number, 10%.
All right, I was getting ready to ask you, Phil. You've sat through a lot of these addresses, both of a state senator and a cabinet officer, and also an observer of politics. How much attention should we pay to them?
Well, first of all, I don't remember when I was a legislator. It was so long ago. But I have sat through a number of them. I think they're. I like history and tradition, so I think it's important from that standpoint. But I also think it's important in that they lay out their agenda, and then next year, when they do the State of the State or whatever, hold them accountable, both sides, and say, you said this last time, and judge them by what they said.
He talked about, let's talk about some of Cooper's recommendations. He wants to increase the number of new pre-K enrollments in North Carolina by 4,700, saying that a $1 investment in early childhood produces $7 in returns. Peg, is this accurate? Is it a good deal for us?
Well, I think early childhood education is always a good deal. I can't quote you the figures because that's not my area of expertise. But it's been demonstrated over time that these investments in these kids, whether it's making sure that they've got health care coverage, whether they have proper education, or whether they have food on their table, pays a great dividend for an entire state.
What he's actually trying to do is eliminate the waiting list for NC Pre-K,
Yes.
which is designed for at-risk 4-year-olds that are very carefully defined and the Republicans have made some changes to that. But I think there's general agreement that actually helps kids who are at risk to do better in school, and it seems silly that we have a waiting list if we can get rid of it.
John, how about the proposal to reinstate the child care tax credits? Cooper says it's going to help working families in our state.
Well, it would give families that have children in child care some additional tax relief. It is one of the worst design programs to accomplish the goal of improving family tax burdens. In fact, the simpler thing to do would simply be to increase the per-child tax credit, which we already have.
Chris, I know one of the things that you enjoyed hearing was him promoting again his Best and Brightest Scholarship Program, which is very closely akin to the old Teaching Fellows Program.
Right.
Students would get $10,000 a year, which would be forgiven if they stay in the classroom for 4 years.
Yeah, and
can he pass it?
Well, interestingly, the Republicans tried to preempt him by having a press conference and unveiling their own, and they actually called it the Teaching Fellows Program. So the good news is that both sides agree we should have a teaching scholarship program in North Carolina, and I expect this will be an area where they can work together to figure out the details.
So where do we expect Governor Cooper and the legislature to find cooperation? Any specific areas?
There's another issue. I agree with that about the Teaching Fellows thing. It has to be well designed. The previous program was not targeted towards schools that actually had trouble or positions that were hard to recruit, and I think the new version will. As to another issue, I would say raise the age. This is the issue of the default age of juvenile jurisdiction. That's something that you've got bipartisan support for. I assume Governor Cooper is for it. And so I think that's another area of potential agreement.
I was interested this past week. Taylor Batten, the editorial page editor for the Charlotte Observer, wrote a column saying that Governor McCrory had gotten steamrolled by the legislature and that Governor Cooper didn't have to. If you agree, tell us what Cooper should do.
Well, I think Cooper's experience in the legislature and his experience as Attorney General, and he has worked with Republicans on some issues in those two jobs. And I think there's still the potential if they can just get over this initial stuff.
I think he's shown signs he's planning to use the bully pulpit.
Well, in some ways he's ways he's freer to use it because he's not going up against his own party. McCrory seemed reluctant to take on fellow Republicans, and I think Cooper will try to work with them, but I also don't think he'll be shy about criticizing them and trying to go over their heads to the people.
Have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle? Well, it's easy to do. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. While you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NCSpin on YouTube, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. How is the repeal and replacement of Obamacare going to affect us? We'll find out in a moment.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Scenic is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Scenic is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Scenic ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
The House of Representatives in Washington fulfilled one of the major objectives of this new administration by presenting their proposal to repeal and replace Obamacare. The proposal was met with mixed reviews by fellow Republicans, especially in the Senate. Peg is our resident health care expert here on NC Spin. The question on most minds is, how would this, if passed, impact North Carolina? What's your assessment?
Well, there have actually been 2 hearings at the General Assembly this past week on the impact of this American Health Care Act on North Carolina. First of all, we have 500,000 people that are insured through the marketplace, so their coverage could be at jeopardy. The Kaiser Family Foundation put together a series of maps, county by county, state by state, demonstrating the winners and the losers in this new plan. And North Carolina, ironically, is all blue, but blue is bad. We could lose up to, in certain counties, 70% of the tax credits and subsidies that help people buy insurance. But more than that part is what this bill could do to Medicaid. It could take the Medicaid program as we know it and turn it into a block grant or a managed care kind of capitated program. That could devastate us in times of a hurricane or when there's an economic downturn.
Of course, we're going to a capitated program on Medicaid anyway.
Well, that's a different kind of capitated program. That's a capitated program for providers, not for the state of North Carolina,
right.
Not for the people. Also, we could lose all our public health prevention funding. That's a little nugget that nobody really realizes. We could lose our vaccination programs, all our heart disease and stroke prevention monies, our tobacco use prevention monies, all that kind of stuff is buried in there. And one of the really frightening things is there are a lot of unanswered questions like what happens to the children's health insurance match? We could lose $200 million in 2 years if this plan goes through.
And seniors could be particularly affected by this.
Oh, absolutely. If you're a low-income older adult, you could get hammered under this.
Phil, I think, okay, so we've got, as Peg says, 550,000 estimated people on Obamacare right now. If we just look at the statistics between the national and how many are going to be taken off the rolls or lose Obamacare nationally, that means as much as 40% of these people might not have health insurance after this is passed. What are they going to do?
Well, first of all, and I don't accuse Peg of this, but I think the opponents are going to continue to, they're opposed to doing away with Obamacare. So I don't trust all the information coming out from either side. I think it's probably like Nancy Pelosi said, we got to pass the bill before we read it. So that's what it reminded me
Well,
of.
that's the way Obamacare was.
That's what I meant.
Essentially, yeah.
Well, this one's moving pretty fast.
I hope so. And I think the cuts are always made to sound worse than
John,
they are.
there's all sorts of speculation that this ain't a done deal yet, and there's going to be lots of negotiating. The Senate will not pass it, we're told, as it now stands. What kind of changes might you expect to be made?
I think there'll be changes in the details. Essentially, you have some people who dispute the entire architecture of this type of plan, which has been the Republican proposal on these issues for 15 years, which is a combination of tax credits, refundable, and some kind of Medicaid reform. I think that will still be the architecture of the final bill, but I think there'll be significant changes in the details having to do with the size of the tax credits at the low end of the income scale. Some of the issues regarding Medicaid and the grandfathering in will probably be changed. But I think this architecture is what will end up passing.
It's worth noting, though, that North Carolina members of the Republican congressional delegation is very divided, and Mark Meadows was on the NewsHour recently complaining about the refundable tax credit portion, saying it creates another welfare program and it's Obamacare light and all that. And I wanted to respond a little bit to what Phil said. The numbers that we could believe is the Congressional Budget Office, which the head of the Congressional Budget Office was appointed by the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, and they're the ones that are putting out these numbers that people are saying we're using as scare tactics to people who don't like this idea, but those are the Republican CBO's numbers.
And they are absolutely absurd. And let me explain why. Number one, it assumes every state will expand Medicaid. That's the assumption in the model. It assumes 7 million people enrolled in the exchanges as of last year that weren't actually enrolled. Okay, that right there is 12 million that was a mistake. It assumes that the mandate, if gone away, 9 million people would no longer buy plans. Not that they would lose their plans, they just would no longer choose to buy them, which is also preposterous.
Choose to buy them or not be able to affordable be able to buy them.
9 million was about the mandate going away, and it is a very, very poor set of numbers. The actual effect is probably not 24 million, but about 5 million, which is still worth worrying about.
I suspect this same debate is taking place in every state across the country. There is so much uncertainty right now,
Well, there's
Peg,
a
going
lot
on.
of questions. I mean, so the numbers that we're looking at in North Carolina came from our own Division of Fiscal Research. So they don't have a dog in the fight. They're just trying to figure out what's going on. But I think one of the things, talking about the Medicaid expansion issue, an unanswered question is will the states who expanded get to keep that extra money, and will states like North Carolina that didn't end up footing the bill for these people forever, and while our people go uninsured?
Lots of unanswered questions, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it as we go on. Borrowing money, that's the topic after we come back after the break.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
Last year, voters in North Carolina approved borrowing $2 billion for the Connect NC bond campaign, aimed primarily at benefiting universities and community colleges. There's several proposals on the table for the state to borrow more money, and we want to talk to our panel about them. Chris, there's several methods for borrowing, for governments to borrow money, including general obligation bonds, limited obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and two-thirds bonds. Help us understand the differences.
And there's self-liquidating bonds.
Self-liquidating bonds.
So the biggest difference for people, I think, to understand is the general obligation bonds have to be approved by the people. The question is, and all these other bonds, in my mind, were created to get around whether or not to put this to a vote of the people. Now, you can say that's a good idea or not, but the fundamental difference between all these things is whether or not we should have a vote on it. Back in the I guess it was the 80s and 90s, we started doing these all sorts of different bonds because we didn't want to put everything on the ballot. We wanted to keep borrowing money. Borrowing money, by the way, is not bad. State governments that have long-term, whether it's highways or buildings, and money is really cheap, the interest rates are cheap, it's a lot cheaper to borrow the money and build something now than it is pay cash and wait 30 years.
So when the voters vote on a bond and approve a bond, the state is putting its full faith and credit?
Right, that's right. There's backing the bonds, and then the state issues the bonds in stages. Which
do the other forms of bonds?
Well, that's a good question. The state is, most people believe the state is doing that, is putting the state's name up there behind these bonds that the people don't have a vote on.
There are even additional evasions, like certificates of participation, which is not technically debt. What it actually allows the bondholder to do is share in the proceeds of owning a little sliver of a prison. And the revenue is simply appropriations from the state. It is a way to evade the Constitution.
That's been one of my lifelong goals, I'll tell you that. Governor Cooper has proposed a sliver of a prison, has proposed borrowing $350 million for limited obligation bonds for universities and state governments, and voters won't get a chance to approve that. One of our legislators said he was disappointed because he thought we'd already done that with Connect NC bonds, and he was concerned we weren't bringing up transportation.
Well,
what do you think?
I think the number one priority now should be transportation, but number two, with our history of passing bond issues, I'm not sure what the concern would be about putting more things on the ballot. As long as you make a good case for it, I think people in North Carolina have proven they'll vote for it by big margins.
Peg, there's also been a suggestion that we need a bond package to build more classrooms. Now, they talked about taking more money out of the lottery proceeds than we currently do.
Right.
But what do you think about a bond package for building classrooms?
Well, I come from Ohio, and that's the way schools are funded county by county, and that's the way we used to raise money to build schools. But right now, the way the law is, we're going to need a whole lot more classrooms because we're requiring them to be smaller, and there's just not space. So, I actually think that's a good idea. It's proven in other states that it works.
I want to ask John and Chris quickly. Do you expect to see anything coming out of this legislature so far as any bond package this year? John?
Not if it isn't a transportation-oriented plan. I agree that that's the focus now, and I think Cooper's a little bit out of step on that.
I think a transportation bond won't even pass. I'm not sure the Senate leadership wants to do that. That would be the one that would pass, whether it's right or not, to not pass other ones. I think that will be the most likely.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Syndicated is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Syndicated is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Syndicated ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.syndicated.org.
One of the best parts of our show is when we ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. They get to choose the topic and sound off for a few seconds about it. John, I'll start with you. John Hood.
Chief Justice Mark Martin, back in the fall of 2015, put together a commission to study the administration of law and justice in North Carolina. I'm one of the commissioners. The commission just issued its report, and one of the recommendations is raise the age that we mentioned earlier, but there are lots of other recommendations about how to manage court cases, how to help pro se litigants, people who represent themselves in court. Interesting set of ideas that will be talked about or implemented by the Administrative Office of the Courts.
These don't have to be approved by the
Some of them are
legislature.
proposals that would probably need some action from some other body, but some of them are things the courts can do themselves.
And one of the biggest urgent problems is
technology,
yeah.
and there is a plan in the recommendations about upgrading technology.
Peg O'Connell, tell us something we don't know.
Well, Tom, the big discussion right now is about health care and the insured and everything. And North Carolina right now has, depending on how you count, 300,000 or 500,000 uninsured. But something I think a lot of people don't realize is 12,000 of those are veterans across the state.
Wow.
They have no other types of coverage. They don't have TRICARE. They can't zip into and out of the VA. And so, you know, as we try to talk about the uninsured in North Carolina, we need to actually understand who they are.
And these uninsured are not without health care, correct? They are getting health care.
Well, yeah, they get in the emergency room.
Exactly.
Which is the most expensive way to get it. So we need a solution for North Carolina about what to do about this. I mean, firefighters, all kinds of volunteers. It's a big issue, and it'll be an economic drag on our state.
All right.
A Republican activist told me the other day that he wished Obama could have stayed in for a third term, and I said, why? And he said that he had almost decimated the Democratic Party during his 8 years. And I said, what do you mean? I researched that Democrats lost over 1,000 legislative seats in the last 8 years. They lost 12 governorships. The Republicans now have twice as many governors as do Democrats. They gained 64 seats in the House and 12 in the Senate. So I think we ought to allow presidents to serve a third term.
Is he predicting, by the way, that Donald Trump might do the same for the Republican Party?
Well, I don't know. I'll ask him. It may be like us talking about how Trump was going to hurt the Republican chances in North Carolina for the down ballot races.
Right.
We saw how that prediction turned out.
And you don't want to speculate so far as the future is concerned.
Not that far ahead.
Chris, tell us something we don't know.
Well, when we were talking about borrowing money, you mentioned that there might be some increased lottery revenue. The worst part of that proposal, the Senate leaders have a plan to help low-income rural areas build schools, which I support and is a great idea, and to pay principals more, which I support and is a great idea. But the way they want to do it is not just use lottery money, but they want to increase lottery advertising from 1% of the lottery budget to 2% of the lottery budget. Just a few years ago, that was widely condemned by a lot of Republicans. And remember, all the Republicans who were proposing that were aggressively and accurately against the lottery when it was passed in 2005. And I think the worst idea is to try to get more money from low-income people in low-income counties in North Carolina through aggressive lottery advertising instead of honestly figuring out a way to pay for it as we go or pay for it through our tax code.
And you're expecting that to happen?
Well, I think there'll be a debate. I think there's still some opposition. I think there'll be an interesting debate about whether or not we should have more aggressive lottery advertising.
Yeah, but Skip Stam is gone.
No, but there's some other folks I hope will step up.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.